In this tutorial, we will be looking at configuring the eFORMz Director Toolkit. The eFORMz Director is the print management and output management component of eFORMz. The Director Toolkit allows you to create and edit configuration files for eFORMz processing. To create a director configuration, we must access the Director Toolkit, and to do so, you can navigate to the Minisoft eFORMz 6 folder and select Director Toolkit.exe, the Director Toolkit executable, or what's often easier is simply to run the eFORMz composer, and from the main menu select Host Tools and then select one of the toolkit options. Local Director Toolkit is for Windows users, but we also have for AS400 iSeries users the AS400 Director Toolkit option, and Unix the Director Toolkit option for Unix. Of course, for Local Director Toolkit is what we'll be using in this example. And select that, and the Director Toolkit will display. You'll see you already have a configuration file loaded in. It's the local pm.cfg file. This is the default configuration file. And to edit that, you can simply right-click the name of the file and select Add Input. And we'll see that there are a variety of options for us. But before we get to those, you could also select local pm.cfg and simply select the Add button to the right, and it will give us those same options. So it's really whichever you're more comfortable with. If you're on a Windows system, either works. If you're not, you'll probably need to use the buttons to the right. So we're going to use local directory. A local directory represents a folder located locally on the system you're running. The source print files from your application software or your output from your application software that eFORMz is going to use as input will reside in this location to be pulled to be merged with an eFORMz process. A remote directory is a source directory for monitoring output files on a remote box. The local iSeries queue is obviously not an option if you're running the local Director Toolkit, but it would be if you were running on an AS400. This allows you to select a queue for monitoring once connected to your local iSeries server. If you wanted to connect to a remote iSeries queue, obviously that is also an option, and then an MQ message queue. We're going to be running a local directory here, and if we select that, the input directory dialog box will display. And we have our name. That's really arbitrary. That's just a descriptive title. What we really want to do is in the input directory field specify our input directory. We'll see if we move this down a little bit, make it easier to see. We have an input directory already configured. It's the Minisoft eFORMz 6 input folder. And of course we could use our browse button to find the input directory. This is where the files will reside from our application software, where they'll be placed for processing with eFORMz. And again, use the browse button and you can navigate and find the correct folder that you intend on using. And again, you can use a different folder than the one that is specified in the default. If you're going to be monitoring for files or sending files across your network and running as a Windows service, for example, you must use UNC paths. And of course, you can also use an asterisk or question mark as a wildcard entry in the source input directory. So we'll select cancel for now because we already have our input directory. But it is important to note that we have a few options here. Check interval in seconds is the number of seconds the queue monitor will wait before checking the input directory for new print files, new data files. Priority is the drop-down menu that will set the priority setting for individual input directories. It's a 1 to 10 scale there. And really, the higher the priority, the more execution time is given to a certain thread. So if you have multiple threads within a process, then which thread happens first, which thread is most important, you can control the priority here. You can also process input files seriously. The default is unchecked. And we also have active intervals, and that's going to set a timed interval check on that particular input directory, based really usually on the day and time of the week. So there's some flexibility there with the input directory, but we'll select cancel out of that because we already have that configured. So we have our input directory, and again we can use the buttons and select add, or we can right click and select Add, and we'll select Add File Selector, and the File Selection dialog box will display. This is where we're going to select the files for processing, and we're going to, of course, select them from the input directory or input folder we just specified. So all files that are in Minisoft eFORMz 6 input that are there, we want to select the right files. So how do we do that? Well, a common way to do that is by extension, and let's say we're bringing in XML or extensible markup language data, then obviously it's going to have the extension of .xml, and we can use wildcard entries, so using an asterisk or a question mark to do that. So for example, let's say it is XML, we could do an asterisk followed by the XML extension. And so we have that, and we see there are some dispositions below here. One of them is change extension of selected file to HLD. That basically will change the extension of the file to HLD, so be careful with that if that's the default. But if you want to retain the XML extension, then you can simply select append HLD to the selected file. And of course we have to have HLD in there at some point, otherwise we'll continue to process the same files over and over again, and we obviously don't want to do that. Another option, of course, is simply just to delete the selected file once it's already been processed. We have additional file selectors below, and if we select that, there are two. File age selector is the first, and we also have file size selector. The most likely uses of both of these would be if you're cleaning up files, whether in the case of file age selector, that'd be cleaning up files that are older than a specific interval. You could also delay processing for a specific interval in order for something else to process first using the file age selector. With file size selector, it's usually deleting the largest files first or at a certain interval, and of course you could also process files based on size as well, so that is less common. And once you've selected that, you can sort by a certain criteria, and again they could do file name, the date and time it's last been modified, and either in ascending or descending order. We'll uncheck that and leave it as is. So we're going to select all XML files in our particular directory, and we'll select OK. And so we have our file selection configured. Now that we have our file selection configured, we can add a processor to it by right-clicking or using the Add button and selecting Add Processor eFORMz. And this is where we're going to get our eFORMz project involved. So we'll select the eFORMz project and using the Browse button. And under Projects, and let's select Sample. We'll select Sample Statement. That'll work. And so we have our sample statement project, and we can select OK. So we have our project that's going to process our files, and those files are being picked up from a specific directory that we've configured. So we have all of that ready to go here. Up next, we're going to want to right-click our processor and select Add Output Process. Now there are three output processes. There is the print process, which is obviously the most common, and we have the file output process, and we have process with eDirect Plus. Process with eDirect Plus is usually used for HTML emailing, but there are a variety of other uses as well. We're going to select print, and the print process dialog will display. And here, again, we select the format. Of course, we can select the printer from the Browse button here, whatever printer that we've defined. And obviously, I don't have any defined on this particular system, but you would usually, depending on the license you purchased, let's say you had a 2-printer license or a 4-printer license, well, you can configure 2 printers and 4 printers respectively. Unlimited licenses, of course, can configure an unlimited number of printers. And so you select the printers you've configured on your local workstation or on your server, and the format, of course, and once you have that, you can click OK and you have the printer configured. The other option, of course, is Add Output Process File Output, and the Output to a File dialog box will display. And we see in the file name field, we have a Browse button. If we open that, we can determine which folder the file name will go to. And we also can give it a name, and we'll just type in sample for now. That's easy enough. And we also can choose the file type. We'll keep it at PDF, but there are a variety of other formats we can output to. So sample, and we just select open. And there it is. We have right there. And we can keep the create unique file name checked if we want to create a unique file output name every time a process is run. It must contain at least 3 characters. The unchecked create unique file name, of course, means that it will just say, in our example, sample every time. But in other words, it's just going to keep the name consistent every time the process is run. So we can select OK, and we have ourselves our folder with the file output and the file name configured. But there's another option. If we go back up to the project and right-click and select Add Output Process, there's Process with eDirect Plus, or it may say Process with eDirect if you're following along. And this will implement an eDirect or eDirect Plus process if a project file has been configured for eDirect or eDirect Plus. The base directory or base folder is going to represent the folder where you would like your output to reside. eDirect and eDirect Plus both by default create subdirectories or subfolders under the base folder for the standard output. If you don't wish to have those subfolders built, just select Disable Standard Subdirectories and it will get rid of that. But of course you find the base directory just by using the Browse button. But we will not be using that, so we can select Cancel. Finally, if you right-click our file output here, you can add a post process. Right-click, select Add Post Process, and we see there's print files, copy files, delete files. There's also an external command option. So post-processing is definitely an option. So we see we have ourselves a process just with one thread here, but we have a process configured with the Director Toolkit, and we can now run our process with the eFORMz director.